Our lesson today is on the subject of metaphors, and of course it wouldn't be a presentation on metaphor if I didn't include the most tired and overused of all metaphors, the iceberg. You can see on this screen we've got the business iceberg and the Freudian iceberg, anger iceberg, success iceberg, the stuttering iceberg, and the plastic waste iceberg, all different kinds of icebergs. Of course, it has its merits because, as you can see, there are lots of things in life that have components that go unnoticed or unrecognized, and yet people get kind of tired of the same old analogies, and so it's important that you do your best to keep your metaphors fresh, and we'll talk about some strategies for doing that as we kind of wrap up our lesson for today. But first we're going to talk about what makes a metaphor and how we linguistically process them. So metaphors seem to skirt the rules of language in general. I'm going to give you some examples of literal sentences and similar sentences that incorporate a metaphor. So first we've got, the hammerhead is a shark. A metaphor similarly constructed might be, my lawyer is a shark. The hurricane destroyed the coastline versus the hurricane devoured the coastline. Universities are productive spaces for ideas versus universities are petri dishes for ideas. To understand each of these metaphors, you need to set aside some of what you know about the usual meanings of certain words. So you have to understand that in the first case, shark is not intended to mean literally a fish with sharp teeth that swims fast. Instead, it's intended to be understood in a more metaphorical sense of being aggressive and strong and tenacious. Similarly, the word devoured needs to be understood differently than literally eating something through the gustatory tract in the mouth with chewing and saliva. Universities being referred to as petri dishes, of course, we mean metaphorically that they're places where things grow rapidly, and specifically in this case it's ideas. Now, some early theoreticians believed that processing a metaphor was much like a car accident, that the car might crash in the middle of the sentence, much like a garden path sentence. You'd have to get out of your car, kind of look around at what went wrong, and figure out a new way to transport yourself. In other words, early theories assumed that you'd have to intentionally see past what was said to what was meant. But that's not really what's happening. Metaphor processing is automatic and simultaneous, by which I mean that it happens without our conscious effort, but it also happens simultaneously, meaning the two potential meanings of a metaphor are both activated at the same time. So, like in the case of my lawyer is a shark, then you represent the idea of the lawyer being both a literal shark and a figurative shark, and they're activated. The word shark is activated in both definitions. So in order to test what was going on, some early researchers would present sentences to participants and ask them to respond with true or false. And they would give them sentences like these. Some birds are robins, obviously true. Some birds are apples, obviously false. Some jobs are birds, that's also false. And some jobs are jails. Now in this last sentence, it actually took longer to answer for participants because it's literally false, but metaphorically true. Some jobs are jails in a metaphorical sense. Now, because we had three different types of sentences against which to compare these metaphorical sentences, there are some conclusions we can draw. The first type of sentence here is a literally true sentence. The second is a literally false sentence. The third is what was called a nonsense sentence, because it could potentially have been understood in a metaphorical way, but it didn't make sense metaphorically. Some jobs are really not metaphorically related to birds, or if they are, it's not obvious how that might be. And so this ends up being false, but it's also nonsensical. Now, since it took longer to process the last sentence here, that was metaphorical, than the nonsensical sentence, this suggests that the metaphorical meaning is processed automatically. Now, the reason why we can conclude this is because the nonsense metaphor is automatically dismissed. Even though there was a potential for a metaphor to occur, it was it was not obvious, and therefore it was quickly and easily dismissed. But when a metaphor becomes potentially apparent, then the brain goes through an alternate process where it has to interpret both of those meanings simultaneously, but it does so automatically. Another example of research that illustrated to us how the brain is processing metaphor went like this. Participants were shown sentences that could be understood metaphorically, like indecision is a whirlpool. And then they were given a lexical decision task. And you remember that a lexical decision task is when you're presented with real words and fake words in sequence. And so you have to decide if each word that's presented is actually a word or is not a real word. So it might be like table, desk, damter, and so forth. But in this case, right after they were presented with a sentence that could be understood metaphorically, they were given a lexical decision task with words like water and confusion. Water, of course, could be understood in a literal sense from this, could be primed in a literal sense from this sentence. The word confusion could be primed in a figurative or metaphorical sense from this sentence. Interestingly, literal meanings were recognized in this study just as fast as figurative ones, suggesting that both meanings are processed simultaneously. So what we're seeing going on is when participants were asked to identify whether words like water and confusion were actual real words, they were faster to recognize these words compared with unrelated words. Like indecision is a whirlpool is not going to prime for you anything about television or a garden. But it will prime for you both literally and figuratively words that are related to this sentence. And these words were processed much more quickly. We could make the decision about whether they were a real or a fake word much more quickly. But because both of these were equally primed, that suggests that the brain is simultaneously activating both meanings of both potential interpretations of the metaphor sentence. So if metaphors are not like a car crash, where we stop mid-sentence and have to consciously think about how to reinterpret this sentence, then what's really going on? Some researchers have suggested that what's going on here is that metaphors are understood like superordinate level categories. But in order to remind you what that looks like, I'm going to start here with basic level categories. So you remember that the definition of a lawyer can be understood as something that consumes a large portion of your waking hours and involves a work exchange for pay. It takes some specific skills that are required. It requires a law degree. It involves arguing for one side in a legal dispute. It requires analytical thinking. It's well paid, etc. These red bullet points here indicate elements of being a lawyer that are unique to being a lawyer, whereas these elements here in black are those that are more generic and apply to other professions or occupations. So these apply to lawyer, but they also apply to dentist, doctor, construction worker. It consumes a large portion of your waking hours, involves work exchange for pay, and specific skills are required. We find that the same thing is true in these other categories. So you've got the example of dog. Of course, it has 4 limbs, it has a spinal cord and brain, it has hair, females nurse their young, but those are true of all mammals, you see. Specific to dogs are other facts, like they're domesticated, they're highly social, and maybe territorial. When we come over here to sharks, we might understand the literal meaning of shark in one sense, but a metaphorical meaning of shark as a superordinate level category in another sense. Now, shark also falls within a superordinate level category that would be fish, but in this sense, it could also fall into a superordinate level category that is the meaning of shark at a metaphorical level. So we would understand that both metaphorical sharks and literal sharks are vicious, tenacious, maybe aggressive and predatory, but only literal sharks, which are a subset of these metaphorical sharks, also swim quickly, have sharp teeth, and have fins. So this is one theory of how we process metaphors. That is, that we process them as superordinate level categories. We kind of understand that there's both a literal meaning of shark, but also a broader meaning of the word. An alternate theory suggests that we understand them in terms of analogy, that we take large bits of knowledge and transfer them from one domain to another. So if we wanted to understand the structure, the function of a tree trunk, we could understand it better by analogy than by literal description. So we could analyze this and metaphorically compare it to a straw by saying a tree trunk is a drinking straw. Now, a tree trunk actually may be taller than a house, and its age can be determined by the number of rings in a cross-section of itself, and things like that, which are not true of a drinking straw, but there are components that are similar across the metaphor. And that is that liquid substance, in this case water, is suctioned upwards from the ground to the leaves. And now we've highlighted these words because those are the things that are elementary in their comparison to the drinking straw. So here in the case of the drinking straw, literally, of course, it's different. It's made of plastic. It can be purchased in bundles. It's manufactured for the specific purpose of drinking from an upright container, but it also allows us to take a liquid substance and suction it upwards from a drinking container to the mouth. So these highlighted elements here suggest a similarity that exists between the drinking straw and the tree trunk. And we can understand the function of a tree trunk better if we compare it to something that's much more familiar to us, like a drinking straw. Other examples of analogy include, if you've taken like a neurobiology class, then you'll have understood the principle of action potentials in the brain. So this is a picture of a neuron, and when action potential is triggered on the like in any given synapse at the beginning of the neuron, then it travels down the length of the axon and has certain features. It requires depolarization and threshold and all or none principle and refractory period. But a lot of times when you take a class talking about these neurons, the action potential is compared to a toilet. And the reason for this is because these principles of depolarization and threshold, all or none, and refractory period are akin to the flushing of a toilet. So when you go to flush a toilet, you might press down slightly on the handle, and if you do that, you can hear kind of like a hissing sound. But if you let go of the handle before it actually flushes, then it won't flush. That's similar to a depolarization. There's a threshold, though. If you push down the handle to a certain extent, there is a point at which it becomes impossible to stop the process. It just is going to flush. And that's similar to this all or none principle, where it's either going to flush or it's not. There's no such thing as like a half flush. If you push down the handle, then it's going to go through the process of flushing. And there's also a refractory period where you can push and push and push the handle while the tank is filling, but it's not going to do any good. You won't be able to flush the toilet again until after the toilet tank is filled, and then you can go ahead and flush a second time. But all of these principles hold true for the action potential as well. It's activated in certain degrees, like pushing down on the handle, and when it reaches a certain threshold, then it's going to fire. There's no such thing as like a partial fire. It's all or none. It's just going to fire all the way down. And after it fires, there's a period in which the neuron needs to recharge itself, and it can't fire again until after that recharging period is done. So this is another example of an analogy that's drawn in a metaphorical fashion. If you've taken a biology class, you may recognize that, you may recall back to a time when you were told that the structure and function of a cell is like a manufacturing plant or a factory. And you'll read a little bit more about this in one of your assigned readings today, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but the point of this slide is to suggest that one theory of understanding metaphor is that it draws analogies for the purpose of understanding. And the reason why we do this is because large bits of knowledge can be transferred from one familiar domain, like a drinking straw or a toilet or a manufacturing plant, to another domain that's less familiar, and we can understand certain principles of those things and carry them over to something like a tree trunk or a neuron or a cell nucleus, and understand then the functioning of the unfamiliar topic based on the familiar functioning of the thing that we know. A third theory of understanding metaphor deals with semantic activation. In this theory, the researchers propose that we have to suppress an obvious meaning and enhance a figurative meaning. And again, this process is simultaneous, wherein we have to both push down and pull up two meanings that are potentially both viable at the same time in order to come to a conclusion about which one is correct. Now, some research that illustrated how this might look involved giving sentences as primes and then probing to ask true or false in response to other sentences that were later given as probes. So some participants were given a literal sentence like, that hammerhead is a shark, whereas other participants were shown metaphorical sentences like, that defense lawyer is a shark. When they were presented with these different kinds of sentences, they could be either given a literal probe or a metaphorical probe. And by that I mean a probe that is consistent with a literal interpretation, or a probe that is consistent with a metaphorical interpretation of the word shark. So if a participant read this sentence, that hammerhead is a shark, and then later was asked to respond to another sentence and say whether it was true or false, they could be presented with a sentence like, sharks are good swimmers. And if they saw a literal sentence, and it was followed by a literal interpretation of the word shark as the probe, then they were much faster to say that this sentence was true than if instead they were presented with a metaphorical sentence that was taking the word shark as consistent with its metaphorical interpretation. If in this case they saw the hammerhead as a shark and then sharks are tenacious, it took them longer to answer that this was true. When we saw the opposite when they read a metaphorical sentence as their prime. So if they read that defense lawyer is a shark, then that would prime a metaphorical interpretation of the word shark. And if then they read a probe that was consistent with that metaphorical interpretation, like sharks are tenacious, they were quick to respond that this is true. But if they saw the word shark used in its literal sense in a probe later on, then they would read sharks are good swimmers, and it would take them longer to respond that that was true. So this process is done automatically, but it still requires a network of background knowledge and a solid vocabulary. And an example of this is, like, if you use the metaphor Socrates was a midwife, what we could be meaning was that Socrates kind of pulled information out of people in the same way that a midwife pulls babies out of women. But in order to understand this metaphor, you have to know that Socrates was an ancient Greek philosopher who used a Socratic method of questioning people to pull out what he felt was pre-existing knowledge and information and highlight that information that they already had latent in their minds. And we'd also have to understand what a midwife is and what she does. So complex metaphors can often be difficult to understand if you lack the necessary background knowledge and a solid vocabulary. But even when you have those things, there's still some processing that needs to happen. It's just done automatically rather than intentionally. And the way that looks, we can understand by hearkening back to the graph, the kind of images that we studied a few days ago when we were learning about word activation. So here we've got a model that shows shark with the meaning 1 and shark with the meaning 2. These, of course, would both be activated by pronouncing the word shark. These sounds would activate these two words simultaneously. But if we were talking about a particularly metaphorical shark, then these meanings of shark in the context of what we're talking about would not be activated. And these metaphorical meanings of the word shark would be activated. These metaphorical meanings, of course, would activate both of these interpretations of the word shark, and we have seen in previous research that I described that both the literal and the metaphorical interpretations are in fact activated. But once the metaphorical interpretation of shark is activated, it can inhibit the literal interpretation of the word shark so that it becomes no longer activated. So it is activated, but it eventually is kind of turned off. Now we can understand these metaphors on a continuum of literalness. At the very far left end, we might say that these are factual statements. Factual statements are literal, straightforward meanings, statements that are to be taken exactly how they're written. So some examples might be like, the man is bald and this desk is very heavy. There are also on this continuum what are called polysemous words. Now let me break this down for you so that you can remember it better. Poly, of course, is many. You probably are familiar with polygon and other words that start with poly, meaning many different. And sem, right here, this is the same sem from semantic. In other words, meaning. So multiple meanings. These are words that have that are used the same in our language, but they have multiple different related, similar meanings. So these are also intended to be taken literally, but they have varied meanings. For example, the athlete ran the race even though he was sick. The ink ran all over the page. Let's try running the program. Jake ran his fingers through his hair. This motor refuses to run. Each of these cases use the same word, but they are related meanings of the word run, but they are different. And if you were to interpret this into another language, it would become very salient. In sign language, for instance, which is my second language, each of these instances of running would be interpreted with a different sign. They're not actually the same word. Like an athlete running the race with his legs is a sign where you grasp your if you put your index fingers as if they were guns, and you kind of grab your index finger against the thumb of one hand and squeeze it, then that's the image of running with your physical legs. But the ink running all over the page would be indicated by a sign of kind of spreading out your hands, spreading out the fingers of your hand across the palm of the other hand to indicate that something was spreading. And then if we were talking about running a program, this would be similar to running for office. You would talk about, you might interpret this as ordering, planning, or as putting it up for something. If you talked about Jake running his fingers through his hair, then this would be interpreted in a way that would be indicative of kind of the actual motion of, in what's called a classifier sign, the actual motion of your hand doing this thing. And when you talk about a motor running, this would indicate kind of the repetitive motion of a motor in action by clasping your claw-like hands. If you put your fingers into claws and interlaced the bent fingers of your hand and kind of rubbed it up and down, then that would indicate that the motor is running. So each of these polysemous words are similar, but could be interpreted into a different language with different meanings. So this is an example of something that's intended to be taken literally, but this word ran is ambiguous and has to be taken within its particular context in order to be understood clearly. Metaphors, of course, is the point of our lesson today, and they fall somewhere here on the more figurative end of the spectrum, where these are intended to be taken figuratively. They're non-literal meanings. And we might say things like, the classroom was a zoo. Maria is a chicken. Her tears were a river flowing down her cheeks. So we're saying something as if it sounds as if it were a literal meaning, but actually it's intended to be taken in a figurative, non-literal way. And at the very far end of the spectrum, we might put jokes, which are also figurative, but they have meanings with a surprise violation embedded in them. We have a day dedicated to humor just a few days from now, so we'll talk more about this then. But what I mean by a surprise violation is that jokes are usually funny if they violate some norm or expectation. And this is usually best if it comes as a surprise. So in the cases that I'm going to show you here, these are high school students who have written metaphors in their paper, but they have taken them in an unexpected direction. So he was as lame as a duck, not the metaphorical lame duck either, but a real duck that was actually lame. Maybe from stepping on a landmine or something. He was deeply in love. When she spoke, he thought he heard bells, as if she were a garbage truck backing up. Of course, these are unexpected directions for the metaphor to take. And when we're processing these, we have to understand that something different is going on here than is going on here. So what is that difference? If we reference dual meanings of a metaphor, like the word zoo, which could be taken to be literally a place with cages full of animals, or a place that's quite chaotic and filled with filled with children who are behaving as if they were animals in a very undignified and chaotic manner. Both of these meanings, as I said before, can be processed automatically and simultaneously. The boundary between the two activated meanings actually overlaps, and so it can be, both meanings can be activated at the same time. But when they don't overlap, like we see in these examples of metaphors over here, it's because they're in opposition to each other. Like this word bells cannot simultaneously mean wedding bells and the bells on the back of a garbage truck. So what we have to do is we have to quickly think about the tension between those two activated meanings and resolve it by consciously suppressing the obvious meaning and enhancing the figurative one. So a metaphor can become funny if it's deautomated, meaning if a sentence like this were to be processed automatically, then that would be just a metaphor. But if you took the word zoo and you did something with it to highlight just something a little different about it so that people had to really consciously think, make an effortful processing here, then it has the potential at that point to become funny. So this can be intentional, as we've shown here, where somebody has kind of forced the issue of allowing this metaphorical idea of hearing bells, which might refer to, of course, some idea of like wedding bells, or it might be like just some psychological, physiological experience of excited neural activation that results in falsely hearing something that isn't there, but because your neurons are so excited, these potential interpretations become incompatible with this new interpretation of a garbage truck backing up. So that was an intentional example, but sometimes something that's just ordinary in your everyday life can be unintentionally de-automated, and you have to consciously think about the distinction between the ordinary metaphorical understanding and the new unintended metaphorical, perhaps accidental innuendo. So here's an example of one instance of an accidental innuendo. So in this case, you can see that these are ordinary signs that you might experience in the course of your everyday life, but one time when you're driving by, you might see these right next to each other and kind of read this and interpret it consciously as the accidental innuendo of Five Guys dicks. Now, to wrap this up, I just want to talk for a minute about using metaphors in real life. There are lots of benefits to using metaphors. For instance, they can help an audience to visualize something intangible in a tangible way. We talked about this in the case of the straw and the tree trunk and those other kinds of things. But this allows the audience to engage with the material you're talking about at a logos level. Remember, this is like the logical level where we're able to make sense of something that would be abstract and difficult to grasp, but you're able to make sense of it in a more concretized way. You can also engage the audience by giving them something that they can relate to. Remember, ethos is like your credibility, your ethic, and so you're trying to cause the audience to feel like you are somebody who's relatable, somebody who you can, who they can connect with. You might also appeal to your audience's emotions. This is at the pathos level, and you might also elevate common things to a higher plane, so something that's relatively mundane. By way of analogy, you can raise it to something that's more than it would have otherwise been. And this, again, is the pathos where we're trying to engage the audience's emotions. Now, how can we use metaphors? Some examples are to use a theme. Perhaps you could use it throughout your entire presentation or as bookends to a presentation, where you start at the beginning by talking about a particular analogy that relates to your topic, and then at the end you kind of bring it back to that place where you had begun talking. You can use a visual metaphor. An example is depicted here, where you might have like the growth of a business related to the growth of a tree. And so you could have at different stages of the business development, you might have different levels of growth on your tree, and you could describe what you expect to happen at each stage of your business growth. And this just becomes something that's relatable and visually interesting for your audience. You should try, though, to make your metaphors original. Remember back at the beginning when we talked about the iceberg metaphor, that's just the most tired and overused metaphor of all time. You want to try to make them original, but don't overkill it. Don't make it so abstract and so original that it's not relevant or easily understood. It's really got to be the kind of thing that they can easily grasp, that takes a complicated subject and makes it simpler, rather than taking a complex subject and even complexifying it further. So in summary, we've talked about multiple theories of metaphors today. We understood from one theory that it might be a way of understanding things as higher level categories, superordinate categories, instead of basic levels. In another theory, we talked about how it might be like an analogy between something that's more concrete and something that's more abstract. We talked about how some theories suggest that it's a suppressed activation of one type of word versus another, but this has to still happen in an automatic fashion, because when it happens in a de-automatized fashion and it has to be consciously done, then it often has a potential to be humorous. And finally, we saw that along a continuum of literalness, we might place metaphors somewhere in the middle, with more extreme examples of literalness on one end and figurativeness on the other end. But the thing that all of these theories has in common is that metaphors are processed automatically, and that the multiple meanings are processed simultaneously, and that in order to process them, you have to have a vast knowledge base and vocabulary.